Before we get into tonight's story, a quick thank you to Rob. This one was his idea, and honestly it is one of the strangest rabbit holes we've ever gone down. Now, let's begin. Picture the American Midwest, somewhere rural, a summer night in 1995, the kind where the air sits thick and still, and the only thing moving is the hum of electrical lines strung between wooden poles on the edge of someone's property. Inside a house, not a laboratory, not a university, not a government facility. A man is alone with a machine he built himself. He is not a scientist with credentials. He is not a physics professor with published papers. He is an amateur, a tinkerer, someone who looked at the rules of the universe and asked a question most people would never dare to ask out loud. And on this particular night, he's about to call a radio show and tell millions of listeners what he thinks he has found. His name is Marcum, and what he describes in the hours and years that follow is either the most elaborate late-night radio hoax in American history, or something far, far more disturbing. He didn't sound like he was guessing. He sounded like someone describing something he had already seen. This is the story of a man who claimed he bent time in his garage, who vanished, who returned, and who left behind a silence that researchers and theorists are still trying to explain decades later. Welcome to Sleep Theories. Turn the lights down low. This one is going to stay with you. Part 1. The Device. July 1995. Coast to Coast AM is not a normal radio program. It never has been. Launched in 1988 and hosted in its classic era by the calm, measured voice of Art Bell, the show specialises in the edges of human knowledge, UFO encounters, government cover-ups, paranormal phenomena, ancient mysteries. The topics that mainstream media will not touch. Art Bell has a gift. He is not a sensationalist. He does not mock his callers or perform disbelief for entertainment. He listens. He asks follow-up questions. He gives people space to explain themselves. And that quality, that genuine patient attention, is what makes what happens on this particular night so remarkable. Because when Mike Marcum calls in, Art Bell listens. And so does an audience of millions spread across North America, tuned in late at night through crackling AM frequencies and the peculiar intimacy of radio. Marcum does not stumble into his explanation. He does not sound nervous. He speaks with the measured, deliberate cadence of someone who has rehearsed, not because he is performing, but because he has been thinking about this for a very long time and wants to get the details exactly right. He describes a device he has constructed over a period of months, not purchased, not borrowed, built by hand from components he sourced himself. At its core, the device involves 6 large electrical transformers arranged in a circular configuration. The precise geometry of the arrangement, he suggests, is important, not arbitrary. The positioning creates a specific kind of field, an electromagnetic environment that, when powered at sufficient levels, produces something unexpected. The power requirements are enormous. We are not talking about a lamp or a household appliance. Marcum describes drawing massive electrical input, the kind of draw that would register on a utility company's monitoring equipment, the kind of draw that lights up a neighbourhood's grid and trips breakers if the infrastructure is not adequate. He powers it up, and something happens. Inside the electromagnetic field generated by the circular transformer array, Marcum says he observes a distortion, not a visual trick, not a lens flare or a camera artifact, something physical, a region within the field where light and space seem to behave incorrectly, where the air itself appears to shimmer in a way that does not correspond to heat or wind or any conventional explanation. He describes it carefully, a pocket, a zone, a place where the normal rules seem suspended, and then he describes the test. He takes a metal screw, small, ordinary, the kind you might find in any hardware store, and he drops it into the field. It does not fall, it does not bounce, it does not roll, it does not spin, it vanishes. Marcum pauses when he describes this moment, not for dramatic effect, more like the pause of someone who is still, even months later, processing what they witnessed. The screw went in. The screw did not come out. There was no sound, no flash, no heat signature, just absence. Art Bell asks the obvious question, where did it go? And Marcum says simply, he does not know, but he has a theory. Part 2, the theory of displacement. To understand what Marcum is suggesting, and why it is not as absurd as it might first sound, it helps to understand a little about how physicists actually think about time. In standard Newtonian physics, time is a backdrop, a fixed stage on which events occur. It does not bend, it does not stretch, it does not pool or eddy. It simply passes, uniformly, everywhere. Einstein changed that, permanently. His theory of special relativity, published in 1905, demonstrated mathematically, and later experimentally, that time is not fixed. It is relative. It depends on the observer's velocity and, crucially, on the gravitational and electromagnetic environment surrounding the observer. Time passes more slowly in stronger gravitational fields. Time passes more slowly for objects moving at higher velocities. These are not philosophical abstractions. They are measurable facts. The GPS satellites orbiting Earth right now require constant relativistic corrections, or they would drift out of sync within hours. General relativity takes this further. Space-time, the unified fabric of space and time, can be curved, warped and distorted by mass and energy. The more extreme the concentration of mass or energy, the more dramatic the distortion. Theoretical physicists have spent decades exploring the implications of these equations. Among the more serious ideas to emerge is the concept of closed time-like curves, mathematical paths through space-time that loop back on themselves. If such paths exist in the real universe, they would represent a mechanism by which time travel, or at minimum temporal displacement, might be physically possible. Separately, there has been significant theoretical interest in what happens to space-time geometry under extreme electromagnetic conditions. Certain configurations of rotating electromagnetic fields, particularly in the presence of high-density energy and specific geometric arrangements, produce mathematical descriptions that begin to resemble the conditions near theoretical wormholes and temporal anomalies. None of this proves that Mike Marcum built a time machine in his garage in rural Missouri, but it does mean that the framework he is gesturing toward, electromagnetic fields as a mechanism for temporal distortion, is not pure fantasy. It is adjacent to real physics. Distant from mainstream science, yes, but not entirely disconnected from it. Marcum, it seems, had done his homework, or stumbled into something that no amount of homework could have prepared him for. Part 3. The Dog. The follow-up call comes sometime after the first. Marcum returns to Coast AM with an update. He has conducted a second experiment. This time, not with a screw. He used a small dog. The specifics are sparse. Marcum does not offer the animal's breed, its age, or whose dog it was. He describes the preparation in broad strokes. The device powered up, the field established, the same distortion visible within the electromagnetic pocket. And then, the dog was introduced to the field. It disappeared. Marcum says he waited. He does not specify how long, but he waited, and the dog came back, alive, physically intact as far as he could tell. No visible injuries, no burns, no signs of trauma in the conventional sense, but disoriented, profoundly disoriented. The animal's behaviour after its return was altered, not in ways that Marcum could definitively categorise, but in ways that seemed beyond a simple fright response. The dog did not seem injured. It seemed, in some fundamental way, confused about where, or perhaps when, it was. Now. Here is where the listener has a choice. You can hear this detail and dismiss it. It sounds preposterous. It sounds like exactly the kind of embellishment a caller would add to make a story more compelling. A disappeared screw is easy to fake. A disappeared dog is a story. A disappeared dog that comes back is something else entirely. But consider for a moment the alternative interpretation. Consider the possibility that Marcum is not embellishing, that he is instead documenting, that the animal returned with behavioural changes because it experienced something temporal, spatial, electromagnetic, that a dog has no framework to process and no language to communicate, that the disorientation was not from fear, but from dislocation. There is a concept in trauma research called temporal confusion, a state in which the brain loses its grasp on chronological sequence following extreme stress or neurological disruption. Human patients who undergo certain kinds of seizures, strokes, or profound psychological shocks describe something similar, a sense that time itself has become unstable, that the present moment does not feel continuous with the moments before it. If what Marcum's device generated was a genuine temporal field, even a brief localized one, then the dog's disorientation might not be a symptom of fear. It might be the only honest response to having been, however briefly, somewhere else in time. Marcum reports these findings to Art Bell with the same measured calm he brought to the first call. He is not excited exactly. He is focused. He has a result and he is reporting it accurately, without interpretation, the way a researcher would. Art Bell asks what he plans to do next. Marcum says he plans to scale up. Part 4. The warning signs. At some point between his early calls and the call that would change everything, something shifts. Marcum contacts Art Bell with a different kind of update. Not a technical progress report. Something more personal, more urgent. He believes he's being watched. The details he describes are individually explainable. Taken together, they form a pattern that unsettles him. He reports unexplained power outages, not just on his property, but in a radius around it. He reports strangers in the area, people asking questions of his neighbours about who he is and what he does. He reports increased attention from official-seeming people whose reasons for being in his neighbourhood are not clear. None of this is verifiable. Art Bell notes it carefully but does not press. This is, after all, exactly the kind of detail that paranoid callers add to their stories to explain why they have no evidence and why no one can confirm their claims. But it is also exactly the kind of detail that would appear in a genuine account of unsanctioned experimentation that had attracted official attention. Consider what Marcum describes having done. He has drawn significant, unusual amounts of electrical power over an extended period. He has, on at least one occasion, caused something to disappear. Whether that something went somewhere or nowhere, the disappearance itself is an event that produces a physical signature. Electromagnetic anomalies of sufficient magnitude are detectable, not by a neighbour with a cell phone, but by monitoring infrastructure built specifically to detect unusual energy events. The United States government has operated electromagnetic monitoring programs for decades. Some are classified, some are openly described in defence research literature. The exact capabilities of such systems are not publicly known, but it is not a conspiratorial fantasy to suggest they exist. They do. The more interesting question is what they do with what they find. Marcum's description of the surveillance period does not have the flavour of paranoia. It does not escalate into wild claims about helicopters or men in black. It is restrained and specific. He describes things that could be explained innocuously, but which, taken together, do not feel innocent to him. Then he stops calling. No announcement, no final transmission, no explanation. Just silence. Weeks pass, then months. And Art Bell's listeners wonder, quietly, in forums and late-night conversations and the analogue predecessor to comment sections, what happened to the man from the Midwest with the electromagnetic device and the vanishing screw? Part 5, The Return, 19. 97, 2 years later. The voice that calls into Coast to Coast AM in 1997 is recognisable. Art Bell knows it. Long-time listeners know it. The cadence is the same. The measured, careful pace is the same. The willingness to describe things precisely without embellishment is the same, but something is different. Not in tone exactly, not in manner, something harder to define. The voice sounds older, not just by 2 years. Anyone's voice changes slightly in 2 years. This is different. This is the quality of age that comes not from the accumulation of calendar time, but from the accumulation of experience. From having been somewhere that changed you in ways you cannot fully articulate. Marcum explains what happened. After his last contact with the show, he had continued working on the device. Not in secret from the public. He had always been private about his work, but in secret from whatever attention he felt gathering around him. He rebuilt and scaled up the transformer array. He increased the power input. He modified the circular geometry based on observations from his earlier experiments. He wanted to create a sustained field. Not a brief distortion, but something stable enough to step into and examine at close range. He got what he wanted, and then something went wrong. Or, depending on how you interpret what followed, something went exactly as it should have, and the results were simply more extreme than he anticipated. He did not intend to enter the field himself, but the field at some point during activation expanded, or shifted, or, and this is Marcum's phrasing, not an embellishment, reached out, and he was pulled through. Part 6. The Other Side of the Field. What follows in Marcum's account is the part that listeners find most difficult to evaluate, not because it sounds impossible. By this point in the conversation, the audience has accepted that something unusual is being described, but because it sounds so specific, he describes waking up. Not a dream, not a hallucination. Waking up in a physical space with physical sensations, ground underfoot, air in his lungs, light from some source above him. Oriented in the basic sense of knowing up from down, left from right. Disoriented in every other sense. The environment is unfamiliar, not in the way that a foreign city is unfamiliar. The layout wrong, the language strange, unfamiliar in a more foundational way. He cannot immediately identify what is wrong, but something is. The technology he encounters is different. Not dramatically, science fiction different. Not flying cars and robot servants, more subtly different. Subtle enough that he questions his own perception. Are these things different, or is he misremembering what they looked like before? The question, he admits, haunts him. People he encounters do not respond to him normally, not hostilely, not with fear, more with the particular confusion of interacting with someone who seems slightly out of step with their context, who asks questions that seem odd, who expects things that are not quite right. He does not know precisely how far he has travelled. He has theories based on the observable differences, but he keeps them to himself for reasons that become clear later in the conversation. What he will say is this: he was not days away from his own time. He was not months away. He was years away. And he spent months, real months, lived months he felt in his body and his mind, trying to understand where he was, how far he had come, and how he might get back. Part 7. The Return Journey. The problem of returning is, in some ways, simpler than the problem of having left. Marcum knows what his device does. He knows the basic principles. He knows the approximate geometry and the approximate power requirements. He does not have access to 6 large commercial transformers in an unfamiliar time, but he is resourceful. He describes a period of acquisition, finding components, improvising replacements, adapting the original design to available materials. The process takes months. He does not elaborate on how he acquires what he needs, or how he funds the project, or where he works on it. There are gaps in the narrative, deliberate gaps, one-senses, where Marcum chooses not to be specific. What he does describe is the moment when the rebuilt device, smaller, cruder, less precise than the original, produces the familiar shimmer, the familiar distortion in the air, the familiar sense that the pocket within the field is somewhere that physics does not apply in its usual way. He steps in deliberately this time, and he comes back. The re-entry is disorienting in a way that is difficult to describe, he says. Not painful, not frightening exactly. More like the sensation of a dream that you feel certain you can remember. Rich, vivid, absolutely real, dissolving as you open your eyes. Not the content of the dream, the quality of it, the sense of a parallel solidity fading back into ordinary existence. He is in his garage, or what was his garage, in his own time, or approximately his own time. Approximately. And that word, that one careful qualifier, is where the story becomes truly strange. Part 8. The Differences. Marcum says it clearly and without drama. He does not believe he came back to exactly the same timeline he left. Not a different world. Not an alternate universe in the dramatic science fiction sense. Nothing so obvious, nothing that would make a casual observer pause. He is in the same house, the same street, the same country, the same approximate era. By all visible measures, he is home, but there are differences, small ones. The kind that you would only notice if you had a very precise memory of the original, which Marcum does, because he spent months in an unfamiliar time holding on to the details of home as a kind of anchor. He memorized things, not because he expected to need to verify them, but because they were what he had. The details of where he came from were, in the absence of anything familiar, the closest thing he had to comfort. When he returns, some of those details do not match. He is careful not to be specific on air. He does not name the events or the people or the facts that are different. He says only that there are discrepancies, small ones, the kind that could theoretically be explained by a lapse of memory if you were willing to accept that explanation. He is not willing. He knows what he remembered. He knows what he finds, and they are not the same. He uses a phrase that Art Bell does not push him on, but that listeners return to again and again in the years that follow. It wasn't the same place I left. 6 words, delivered quietly, without self-pity or alarm, as a statement of fact from a man who has had a great deal of time to come to terms with what it means. The concept he is gesturing toward, returning from time travel to a slightly different version of the timeline you departed from, is not new to theoretical physics. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, developed by Hugh Everett in 1957, suggests that quantum events branch reality into diverging paths. The branches are typically imperceptible from within any single branch, but they are distinct, different. Each one is a genuine reality, equally valid, equally complete. If Marcum's device genuinely displaced him through time, and if the quantum mechanics of such displacement involve branching, as some theoretical frameworks predict, then what he describes is entirely consistent with the physics. He did not return to his timeline, he returned to a timeline, similar enough to pass casual inspection, different enough that he knows, and there is no mechanism for going back. Once you are in a branch, you are in it. The branch you came from did not pause while you were gone. It continued. It is still continuing, somewhere in a superposition of possibilities that you can no longer access. Marcum does not say any of this explicitly. He does not frame it in the language of quantum mechanics. He says only what he observed, what he felt, what he knows to be true despite having no way to prove it, and then he stops calling. Part 9. The Conspiracy. In the years that follow Marcum's final appearance on Coast to Coast AM, a theory develops. Not among fringe groups who accept every strange story without scrutiny. Among people who have listened carefully to all of his calls, the early ones, the middle ones, the final return, and find something in the texture of his account that resists the simple explanation of hoax. Hoaxes tend to escalate. They tend toward drama. They tend to produce details that are designed to impress rather than details that are merely accurate. Marcum's account does the opposite. It contracts around the things he is most certain of and expands only where he is uncertain, and he marks his uncertainty explicitly. He says things like, "I don't know exactly. I'm not sure. I can't be certain." These are not the phrases of a man performing a story. These are the phrases of a man trying to be honest about the limits of his knowledge. The conspiracy theory that emerges is not that Marcum lied, it is that he told the truth, and that what he described, a localized electromagnetic anomaly capable of producing temporal distortion, is precisely the kind of thing that certain programs within the American defense and intelligence establishment would have a very strong interest in containing. The monitoring of electromagnetic anomalies is not speculative. The Department of Defense operates numerous programs dedicated to detecting unusual energy signatures across the continental United States. Some of these programs are openly described in defense research literature. Others are not. The exact capabilities of classified monitoring infrastructure are unknown, but the basic fact of its existence is not in dispute. If Marcum's device generated a genuine electromagnetic event, one powerful enough to produce measurable distortions, it would have been detectable. The question is not whether it would have been noticed. The question is what would have happened next. The theory holds that what happened next was contact, not the kind involving handcuffs and public charges, the quieter kind, the kind that involves a conversation about the importance of discretion, about what someone has and what it would mean if the wrong people had access to it, about the various ways that continued public discussion of sensitive discoveries tends to complicate lives in ways that are difficult to recover from. No threats, no violence, just a clear communication about consequences, and Marcum, the theory suggests, understood. He withdrew, he stopped calling. He disappeared from public discussion not because he was arrested or harmed or killed, but because he made a rational calculation and decided that the cost of continuing was higher than he was willing to pay. There is no evidence for this. There is also no evidence against it. What there is absence. Marcum never surfaced again in any verifiable way. No interviews, no written accounts, no verified follow-up contact. For a man who twice called one of the most listened to radio programs in North America to describe experiments he'd been conducting, the total subsequent silence is striking. People who tell hoax stories as a rule do not simply stop. The attention is the point. They find new audiences, new platforms, new iterations of their story. They do not go quietly and completely dark. Marcum did. Part 10. What the recordings tell us. The calls to Coast AM were recorded. They still exist. They're archived in multiple places, accessible to anyone who wants to listen. People have done more than listen. Over the decades since the original broadcasts, engineers and researchers and curious obsessives have analysed the recordings, not for obvious signs of deception, the manipulation of emotion, the inconsistency of detail, the tells that experienced fraud examiners look for. What they listen for is something more specific to Marcum's particular kind of claim: technical accuracy. Marcum's descriptions of his device, the transformer configuration, the electromagnetic geometry, the power requirements, the nature of the observed effects, are consistent with real physics in ways that are genuinely difficult to fake convincingly. This is not because they describe a working time machine. They do not contain sufficient detail to replicate. It is because the things he says that can be checked against physics are correct. The principles he invokes are real. The behaviour he describes the field exhibiting is, under certain theoretical frameworks, plausible. This does not prove the machine worked. It does suggest that Marcum either had a serious working knowledge of electromagnetic physics, which is possible if unusual for an amateur, or that he had actually been observing real phenomena and was describing what he saw rather than what he invented. There is also the question of what he does not describe. A skilled fabricator constructing a compelling false account tends to overspecify. They fill the gaps with invented detail because invented detail feels convincing. Marcum's account has notable gaps. He does not know exactly where he went. He does not know exactly how far. He cannot explain the mechanism by which his improvised return device worked well enough to actually produce a return. He says multiple times in multiple ways, "I don't fully understand why it worked." That is not the language of a storyteller. That is the language of a practitioner, someone who has results he cannot fully account for. Someone who is honest about the gap between what he knows and what he suspects. Whether that makes him a time traveller or simply a very careful liar is a question that cannot at this remove be definitively answered. But the recordings sit there, preserved in the archives, waiting for someone to finally ask the question that resolves everything. No one has yet. Part 11. The Physics of the Impossible. Let's stay with the science for a moment. Not because we're going to resolve it, but because the degree to which Marcum's story intersects with legitimate theoretical physics is more significant than most people realise. The central mechanism Marcum describes, high-intensity electromagnetic fields producing spatial and temporal distortions, is not a concept he invented. There is a serious body of theoretical work exploring the relationship between electromagnetic fields and space-time geometry. It sits at the intersection of classical electrodynamics and general relativity, and while it remains largely theoretical, rather than experimental, it is not fringe science. It is the kind of science that appears in peer-reviewed journals and is discussed at academic conferences, carefully hedged and heavily qualified, but present nonetheless. One particularly relevant area of research concerns what physicists call frame dragging, the phenomenon, predicted by general relativity and confirmed by experiment, by which a massive rotating body literally drags the fabric of space-time around with it. The effect is subtle in ordinary circumstances. Around a sufficiently massive and rapidly rotating object, a neutron star or a rotating black hole, it becomes extreme. Space-time does not merely bend around such objects, it twists, it drools, it forms structures that, in the mathematics, begin to resemble closed time-like curves. The extension of this thinking to electromagnetic systems, replacing rotating mass with rotating electromagnetic fields as the driver of space-time distortion, is a step that some physicists have taken seriously, though quietly. The mathematics become complicated very quickly, and the energy requirements implied by even the most optimistic theoretical frameworks are staggering. But the idea that there is some relationship to be found between electromagnetic geometry and temporal structure is not a product of science fiction. It is a live theoretical question. Marcum's device, as he describes it, would not have come anywhere near the energy densities required by mainstream theoretical frameworks. Not even close. The power he describes drawing is large by household standards and negligible by astrophysical ones. But here is the thing that the conspiracy-minded listener returns to again and again. What if the energy requirements of the mainstream theoretical frameworks are wrong because the mainstream theoretical frameworks are incomplete? What if there is some coupling between electromagnetic geometry and space-time that the standard model does not account for? What if Marcum stumbled onto something real not because he understood the physics better than professional physicists, but because he was doing something, some precise combination of geometry and frequency and intensity, that happened to hit a resonance that the theoretical frameworks do not predict because they have not been looking for it? Science is full of discoveries made accidentally by people who were looking for something else, or by people who were not formally trained and therefore were not constrained by the assumption that certain things are impossible. The establishment of a thing as impossible has often preceded its achievement by a remarkably short interval in the history of human innovation. We are not arguing that Marcum built a time machine. We are arguing that the dismissal of his account, because time travel is impossible, and therefore he must be lying, is not as scientifically sound as it sounds. Impossibility is a strong claim. It demands strong evidence. The evidence that what Marcum describes is physically impossible is, at this point, theoretical. And theoretical impossibility has a complicated history. Part 12. The silence has a shape. One of the most telling things about the Marcum case, if we can call it a case, is the nature of the absence that follows his final broadcast appearance. Think about what the internet does to stories like this. Think about how the information ecosystem works in the era of archives and search engines and the relentless human appetite for resolution. When someone makes a dramatic claim and then disappears, the natural outcome in the modern world is that people go looking for them. They search records, they file freedom of information requests, they contact local newspapers, they drive to the address and knock on the door. They find the people who knew them and ask questions. This has happened with Marcum's case. People have looked. Researchers with genuine investigative skills and genuine access to information-finding tools have spent real time trying to locate Mike Marcum, to confirm his existence, to verify his location, to determine what became of him after his final call. They have found nothing definitive, not proof that he died, not proof that he moved abroad, not proof that he changed his name or withdrew to some remote location of his own choosing, not a confirmed photograph, not a verified address, not a social security death record, not a driver's license renewal, not the digital shadow that ordinary people leave simply by existing in a modern society. Just absence. Now, there are mundane explanations for this. Some people are genuinely difficult to find. Some people work deliberately to minimize their digital presence. Some people live in ways that leave fewer records than others. The absence of a digital footprint is not proof of anything except the absence of a digital footprint. But consider the constellation of absences. A man makes nationally broadcast claims about experiments he has conducted. He is contactable. He calls in, which means he can receive calls. He disappears from public view. He returns 2 years later with an extraordinary account. He makes that account public, with names and details and enough specificity to potentially verify. And then he vanishes again, this time permanently, without leaving any trace that can be confirmed despite decades of subsequent searching. Each individual absence is explainable. The pattern of absences is harder to explain away. And the theory that what happened to Mike Marcum was not disappearance but removal, not abandonment but arrangement, lives in that pattern. Not in any single fact, in the shape of all the missing facts together. Part 13. What it means. If any of it is true, let's do something uncomfortable. Let's take the story seriously for a moment. Not uncritically, but seriously. Let's ask what it would mean if a fraction of what Mike Marcum described is accurate. If his device produced genuine temporal distortion of any kind, even brief, even localized, even on the scale of microseconds rather than years, then what he built represents something profound. Not just a scientific discovery, a proof of concept, evidence that temporal displacement is possible at energy scales, accessible to amateurs working in residential settings with commercially available components. That is not a minor thing. That is not a curiosity. That is a paradigm collapse. The implications would cascade immediately and irreversibly. If a man in rural Missouri can build a machine that distorts time, then the question of who else has built one, with better resources, better understanding, better geometry, better materials, becomes urgent. If the effect is real and scalable, then the question of who controls access to temporal displacement technology is not a philosophical question. It is a strategic one, a military one, an existential one. Governments have gone to extraordinary lengths to suppress or control technologies with far less dramatic implications than this. The history of classified research into unconventional physics, documented, partially declassified, and publicly accessible in fragments, suggests that there is significant institutional interest in the areas of research that border on what Marcum describes. Programs like Stargate and MKultra and dozens of others whose names we do not know represent an institutional willingness to spend enormous resources on the apparently impossible when the payoff, if it exists, justifies the investment. In this context, the question is not whether the government would have been interested in Marcum's work if it was real. Obviously they would. The question is what form that interest would take, and whether what looks, from the outside, like a man who simply stopped calling into a radio show might look very different from the inside. We cannot know. We're working from recordings of radio broadcasts in the absence of subsequent evidence. The story is, at its foundation, unverifiable. It lives in the space between the possible and the provable, which is exactly where the most interesting things in human experience tend to live. Part 14, The History of the Impossible Machine. To understand why Mike Marcum's story captured the imagination of so many people, and why it has refused to fade in the decades since, it helps to understand that he was not operating in a vacuum. He was one voice in a long, strange lineage of amateur experimenters who claimed to have discovered properties of electromagnetism that mainstream science had overlooked, dismissed, or suppressed. The history of fringe physics is not entirely a history of delusion. It is also a history of premature dismissal. Some of the most important discoveries in the history of electricity were made by people without formal credentials working in conditions that the established institutions of their time would have found laughable. Michael Faraday, arguably the greatest experimental physicist of the 19th century, had no university education. He began his career as a bookbinder's apprentice and taught himself chemistry by reading the books he was paid to bind. The Royal Institution initially regarded him with the particular condescension that institutions reserve for people who presume to participate without permission. He persisted. He discovered electromagnetic induction. He changed everything. This is not to suggest that every garage experimenter is a Faraday in waiting. The vast majority of unconventional physics claims are wrong. Not suppressed, just wrong. The history of fringe science includes an enormous amount of self-deception, wishful thinking, and the particular cognitive bias by which people who have invested significant effort in a project become unable to evaluate its results objectively. But the history of fringe science also includes repeatedly the phenomenon of the correct intuition that arrives before the theoretical framework to support it. Tesla described wireless energy transmission decades before the physics of electromagnetic wave propagation was fully understood. Certain researchers working on what they called etheric phenomena in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were describing, in imprecise and sometimes mystical language, effects that modern plasma physics would recognize as real. The intuition preceded the vocabulary, and the vocabulary preceded the institutional acceptance, and the institutional acceptance preceded widespread acknowledgement that the intuition had been right. Marcum fits this lineage in certain respects. He's describing effects that, to his knowledge, and by his own admission, he cannot fully explain theoretically. He has observed something. He is reporting what he observed. He is not claiming to know why it works, only that it does. That is, in its way, a scientifically honest position. It is the position of the empiricist who trusts observation over theory when the two conflict. The question of whether what Marcum observed is what he thinks it is, whether the vanishing screw went somewhere in time rather than simply failing to be found in space, is separate from the question of whether Marcum observed something. The former is unverifiable. The latter is not obviously impossible to believe, given that Marcum was building real electrical equipment, drawing real power, and operating in a domain, high-intensity electromagnetic fields, where unusual effects are genuinely documented in the scientific literature, even if they fall short of temporal displacement. What is certain is that the story does not stand alone. It sits within a context of human inquiry, imperfect, passionate, often deluded but sometimes extraordinarily consequential, into the nature of time and space and the possibility that the walls we assume between the past, the present and the future are not as solid as they appear. Marcum is one name in a long list of names. The list includes credentialed researchers and self-taught tinkerers, serious physicists and enthusiastic amateurs, people who found nothing and people who found something they could never prove. He is not the first man to claim he touched the edge of time. He may not be the last. But something about his account, that particular persistent texture of quiet seriousness, keeps him in a category by himself. Part 15, the art bell factor. Any serious examination of the Marcum case has to contend with the medium through which it was delivered, coast-to-coast AM, in the era of Art Bell. Art Bell is one of the most significant and most underappreciated figures in the history of American media. From a studio in the Nevada desert, literally in the middle of nowhere, in a small town called Pahrump, he built an audience of millions. At his peak, Coast to Coast AM was heard by somewhere between 15 million and 25 million listeners per week. These numbers put him in the company of the most popular talk radio hosts in the country, which is astonishing given that the subject matter of his show was, by conventional media standards, completely unsaleable. What Bell understood, intuitively, perhaps more than analytically, was that there is an enormous audience for serious engagement with the unexplained, not mockery, not debunking, not the reassuring condescension of someone explaining why the strange thing you experienced was actually a weather balloon or a psychological episode. Genuine, patient, open-minded engagement. The willingness to sit with a caller for an hour and explore a claim without demanding that it resolve into a comfortable conclusion. This approach created something unusual, a space in American media where people who had experienced or discovered or built something outside the mainstream felt safe saying so publicly. The callers to Coast AM in the Bell era include, alongside the obvious fantasists and attention seekers, a striking number of people who sound like they're telling the truth about something genuinely unusual. They sound like this because Bell's format selects for them. The performative, escalating caller, the one who is there for entertainment, tends to reveal himself quickly through his willingness to be led by audience expectation. The honest caller, the one who is there because he has something real to report, tends to hold his ground when Bell pushes back, tends to acknowledge uncertainty, tends to be more interested in accuracy than impressiveness. Marcum falls clearly into the second category. You can hear it in the recordings. When Bell challenges him, he does not double down dramatically. He qualifies. He distinguishes between what he saw and what he interprets it to mean. He says multiple times that he could be wrong about the explanation even if he is certain about the observation. This is not the behaviour of a performer. It is the behaviour of someone who is trying to be taken seriously for legitimate reasons. Bell himself, who was not a credulous man despite his subject matter, or perhaps because of it, treated Marcum differently than he treated most callers with spectacular claims. He gave him time, he followed up. He expressed something that, in Bell's careful way, registered as genuine interest rather than entertainment interest. The subtle distinction between those two things is audible in the recordings to anyone who has listened to enough Coast to Coast to calibrate. Bell died in 2018. He never publicly resolved his view of Marcum's calls. He mentioned them over the years as something he thought about, as something that stayed with him. That is not a conclusion. But it is a data point from a man who had spent decades listening to thousands of extraordinary claims and had developed a very precise sense of the difference between the ones that held together and the ones that didn't. He thought Marcum's held together. Whatever that means, it means something. Part 16. Living outside of time. There is a dimension of Marcum's account that gets less attention than the physics or the conspiracy theory, but that may be the most human and the most disturbing aspect of the whole story. Imagine it for a moment. Not the device, not the field, not the distortion. After. Imagine waking up and not knowing when you are. Not where, when. The spatial equivalent, waking up in an unfamiliar place, is disorienting but manageable. You look for landmarks, you ask for directions, you orient yourself relative to things that do not move, mountains, rivers, coastlines, the position of the sun. You may be lost, but lost has a solution. You find your way back. But when? That is different. You cannot look up at the sky and determine the year. There is no compass that points toward the present. You can observe, you can make inferences, you can look at the technology around you and try to date it, look at the fashion, listen to the music, find a newspaper and read the date printed on it. But the newspaper's date tells you where in official chronology you are. It does not tell you how far you are from where you started, because you do not know the exact point you started from in universal terms. You know it in personal terms. You know you were in your garage on a specific afternoon, with specific things on your mind. But personal terms do not map cleanly onto historical chronology when you're trying to measure the distance between 2 points on a timeline from the vantage point of one of them. Marcum describes spending months in the unfamiliar time. Months. That is not a brief disorientation. That is an extended experience of being somewhere you're not supposed to be, among people who are living in a moment that is not yours, engaging with a world in which your entire life up to the point of displacement has either not yet happened or has already concluded. Every conversation is a kind of performance. Every relationship is provisional. You cannot build anything real because you know, or believe you know, that you do not belong here and that the project of belonging is a false one. What Marcum describes is, if taken seriously, a form of radical homesickness for which there is no word in any language because until the moment it was experienced, it had never been a possible human experience. The longing not for a place but for a time. The ache not for familiar surroundings but for the correct position on the axis of history. The sense of being present and absent simultaneously, physically here, temporally nowhere. And then the question of the return, even if you can build another device, even if the device works, even if you can navigate back to approximately where, when, you came from. What are you going back to? Not exactly the same point. Not exactly the same world. A world that looks like your world, that has the same broad shape as your world, but that differs in ways you will spend the rest of your life noticing and not being able to explain to anyone without sounding like you have lost your mind. Because you cannot say, the world is different because I left it and came back, and the quantum branching of my departure and return has left me in a subtly different timeline. You cannot say that to your family, to your friends, to your doctor, to your neighbours. You say it once, on a radio show, to an audience of millions who will forget most of it, and then you carry the knowledge alone for the rest of your life. That is the human dimension of the Marcum story. Whether or not the device worked, whether or not the displacement was real, the experience of believing it, of having lived through something that the available vocabulary of human experience cannot describe, is itself a real thing. And Marcum carried it alone until the signal stopped. Epilogue: The Signal That Faded. The recordings of Mike Marcum's calls to Coast AM are still out there. They have never been officially addressed, denied, or confirmed by any party with institutional authority. Art Bell referenced them occasionally in later years, with the particular quality of attention he gave to the stories that never fully resolved. Not promotion, not dismissal, but a kind of careful preservation, as if he understood that the story's value lay precisely in its incompleteness. For most people who encounter the Marcum story, the comfortable conclusion is the simple one. He was a creative and convincing caller who told a good story, enhanced it over 2 years, and then moved on with his life. Millions of people call radio shows. Most of them disappear into ordinary life afterward. There is nothing suspicious about a caller who stops calling. That explanation is available. It requires the least revision of your existing understanding of the world. It is internally consistent, and it might be right. But something about Marcum's account resists it. Not dramatically, not in a way that demands you abandon the skeptical explanation. More quietly than that, the precision of his technical language, the absence of escalation, the return, 2 years later, with a story that does not maximize for entertainment, but instead focuses on the disorienting specifics of what displacement actually felt like. The way he says, "It wasn't the same place I left," as a quiet observation, rather than a dramatic revelation. These are not the signals of performance. They are the signals of honesty. Imperfect, incomplete, unverifiable honesty. The kind that does not have all the answers, because the person giving the account does not have all the answers, and knows it. Somewhere out there, the original recordings sit in their archives. They have been listened to by engineers and physicists and conspiracy researchers and curious insomniacs at 3 a.m. None of them has resolved the question. All of them have walked away with something, an impression, an uncertainty, a nagging sense that the simple explanation is not quite sufficient. That is the thing about Mike Marcum. Not that he is certainly telling the truth, not that his device certainly worked, not that time travel is certainly real. The thing about Mike Marcum is that you cannot be certain he isn't, and in the universe of anomalous claims, that uncertainty, that small, persistent, irresolvable doubt, is rarer than you think. Most strange stories collapse under scrutiny. They develop internal contradictions. The details shift. The storyteller embellishes. The account drifts from the possible into the clearly impossible, and you feel the ground of plausibility give way beneath it. Marcum's account does not do that. It stays stubbornly within the boundaries of the conceivable. It does not ask you to believe in magic. It asks you to believe in a specific, testable, theoretically grounded physical phenomenon that even professional physicists acknowledge they do not fully understand. And then it goes quiet. The signal fades. The man disappears into the noise of time, and you're left with the recordings and the gap where the follow-up should be, and the question that has no answer. What did Mike Marcum actually find out there in the field? And whatever it was, wherever it took him, did he ever truly come back? A man built a machine in his garage and accidentally stepped outside of time. That is the story of the caller who came back, or who claimed to, or who was, in some meaningful sense, never quite able to return to the place he left. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, I'd really appreciate it if you could use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much. And if you want, comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The discovery began with something so small that most people would have dismissed it entirely. Noah Klein sat in his cubicle on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Seattle, staring at a screen filled with error logs that nobody else wanted to review. His job title was Back-End Systems Auditor, which was a polite way of saying he spent 40 hours a week reading through the digital garbage that enterprise software produced when something went slightly wrong, but not wrong enough for anyone to care. He had been doing this work for 6 years. He was good at it because he had the kind of mind that found patterns in chaos, the kind of brain that could spot the single discordant note in an orchestra of data. Most people found his work unbearably tedious. Noah found it calming. Numbers didn't lie. Systems didn't have hidden agendas. Code did exactly what it was told, even when what it was told was stupid. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Noah was contracted to review archived error logs for a global cloud storage provider called Cirrus Systems. The company stored data for hospitals, banks, universities, telecommunications companies, and millions of individual users across 6 continents. Their infrastructure was enormous, redundant, and theoretically fail-safe, which meant, of course, that it failed constantly in small, invisible ways that Noah was paid to catalogue and explain. He had been scrolling through timestamp errors for the better part of an hour when he noticed something unusual. A cluster of identical errors, all occurring within the same 1-second window. That alone wasn't remarkable. Coordinated failures happened, but these errors weren't coordinated. They appeared across systems that had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Financial servers in London, weather satellites feeding data to stations in Tokyo, hospital databases in Mumbai, telecommunications networks in Sao Paulo, all recording the exact same microtiming drift at the exact same moment. Noah leaned closer to his screen. The timestamp drift was minuscule, measured in milliseconds, but it was identical across all systems, down to the 10th decimal place. These systems did not share clocks. They did not synchronize globally. They operated on entirely different networks, different continents, different security protocols. There was no technical reason they should experience the same timing error at the same instant. Noah opened a new terminal, window, and started pulling data. He expanded his search parameters, querying not just Cirrus Systems, but every client database he had access to through his contract clearances. The search took 11 minutes to compile results. When the data populated, Noah felt something shift in his chest. A small, cold weight settling into place. The anomaly wasn't limited to Cirrus Systems, it was everywhere. Across every major infrastructure network he could access, the same timestamp drift appeared. Power grids, air traffic control systems, stock exchanges, university research databases, government weather services. All of them showed the same error, the same correction, the same silent adjustment occurring within a single second on the same date. October the 3rd, 3:15 and 42 seconds in the afternoon, Pacific time. Noah checked the date. Today was October 17th. This had happened 2 weeks ago, and somehow no one had noticed. Or if they had noticed, no one had said anything. He spent the rest of the day pulling more data, cross-referencing systems, checking and rechecking his methodology. The scope of what he was seeing expanded with each query. Banking systems operated by SWIFT, the worldwide financial messaging network, the European Organisation for Nuclear Research, known as CERN, with their precision timing systems for particle collision experiments, the International Space Station telemetry feeds, the Global Positioning Systems satellite network maintained by the United States Space Force, India's Regional Navigation Satellite System, China's Beidou constellation, Japan's Quasi-Zenith satellite system, all of them. every single one. The same microsecond-level timestamp drift, appearing like a fingerprint across systems that had no business sharing any commonality whatsoever. By the time the sun set over Puget Sound and the office lights automatically brightened to compensate, NOAA had confirmed the pattern across 47 independent systems in 19 countries. The error code, when it appeared at all, was always the same. R Sync Anomaly Autocorrect. Not a standard error designation, not something that appeared in any official documentation he could find. Identical timestamp drift, identical correction, all occurring in the same impossible moment. There was no blackout that day, no solar flare, no reported cyber attack, no equipment failure, no official incident report of any kind. He checked news archives, government databases, technical bulletins from every major infrastructure organisation. Nothing. October 3rd had been, by all official accounts, a completely ordinary day, just a subtle discrepancy in time, and once noticed, it could not be unseen. NOAA stayed late that night, alone in the office except for the cleaning crew that moved quietly through the halls with vacuum cleaners and trash bins. He built a visualization of the data, a timeline that showed the anomaly spreading across the globe in perfect synchronization. It looked like a wave, except waves had a source point. Waves propagated outward. This appeared everywhere at once, as if reality itself had stuttered, and then corrected itself before anyone could notice. He saved his work to an encrypted drive and went home to his apartment in Capitol Hill. He didn't sleep well. His mind kept turning over the problem, examining it from different angles, searching for the rational explanation that would make everything make sense again. The next morning, NOAA arrived at work early and immediately began searching for historical precedents. If this had happened once, it might have happened before. He wrote a script to scan archived logs going back 10 years, searching for similar patterns of synchronized anomalies. The script ran for 3 hours. When it finished, NOAA stared at the results with a growing sense of unease. There were earlier instances, not many, but enough to establish a pattern. 8 events over the past decade, each one showing the same signature of synchronized global corrections. May 17th of the previous year, March 9th 2 years before that, September 22nd 4 years back, November 3rd 6 years ago, February 11th 7 years prior, October 19th 8 years back, June 6th 9 years ago. And the earliest one he could find, January 29th, 10 years ago, almost to the day. Each time, the same signature appeared. Brief global anomalies, mass timing inconsistencies, unexplained synchronization errors that appeared across disconnected systems and then quietly corrected themselves. NOAA started pulling up news archives for each date. He wanted to know what else had happened on those days, whether there were any major events that might explain or coincide with the corrections. May 17th of the previous year, a major cryptocurrency exchange had experienced what they called a temporary desynchronization event that lasted 43 seconds. During that time, transactions were processed, but not recorded properly. The exchange blamed it on server maintenance and compensated affected users. No regulatory investigation was ever opened. But NOAA noticed something else. That was the same day that several major social media platforms reported unusual activity spikes, with millions of users posting and then deleting content within minutes, claiming they didn't remember writing the posts. March 9th 2 years before, nothing major in the news. But when NOAA dug deeper, he found scattered reports of GPS malfunctions affecting commercial aviation across the Pacific Rim. Planes hadn't crashed, but pilots reported their navigation system showing impossible positions for brief moments before correcting. The incidents were attributed to solar activity, despite the fact that there had been no significant solar events recorded that week. September 22nd, 4 years back. This one was more interesting. That was the day of what conspiracy theorists called the Reddit blackout mystery. For approximately 90 seconds, users across multiple continents reported seeing posts and threads that didn't belong in their timeline. Old posts appearing as new, deleted content briefly visible, comments responding to threads that didn't exist yet. The official explanation was a caching error during a database migration, but Noah found something else. September 22nd was also the date that CERN had reported unexpected fluctuations in their atomic clock network. Not a malfunction, they insisted, just an interesting anomaly that occurred during a routine calibration. The fluctuations happened at exactly the same time as the Reddit incident. He kept digging through each date. The patterns emerged like hidden images in static. November the 3rd, 6 years ago, coincided with the infamous Mandela effect surge, where thousands of people simultaneously reported remembering Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, despite him having lived until 2013. That same day, Wikipedia administrators noted an unprecedented number of users claiming that articles had been changed without edit history logs. The claims were dismissed as mass confusion, but the volume was statistically unusual. February 11th, 7 years prior, was the date of a global financial trading anomaly, where stock prices briefly showed values that would have required transactions that never occurred. Trading was halted for 17 minutes across Asian markets. Regulators blamed a software glitch in high-frequency trading algorithms, but no specific bug was ever identified or fixed. October 19th, 8 years back, was harder to trace, but Noah eventually found references to it in obscure technical forums. Database administrators around the world reported that backup verification processes were failing because current data didn't match archived snapshots. Not corruption. The data was valid. It just didn't match records that had been created only days before. The explanations range from backup software bugs to administrator error, but the timing was global and simultaneous. Each time, nothing catastrophic happened. Official explanations, when they existed at all, were vague and technical. Atmospheric interference, quantum fluctuations in atomic clocks, software bugs in timing protocols. The data was quietly corrected and everyone moved on. But Noah noticed something else. The dates weren't random. He created a spreadsheet tracking technological milestones. May 17th of the previous year was 3 months after the activation of the final nodes in the European Union's quantum encrypted financial network. March 9th, 2 years before, occurred 2 weeks after worldwide Internet of Things device connections exceeded 50 billion active units. September the 22nd, 4 years back, came immediately after a major expansion of global satellite networks, adding 3,700 new communications satellites to low Earth orbit. It was as if the anomalies occurred when the system became too complex, when too much data was being processed, when too many connections were being made, when the infrastructure of reality itself was being expanded beyond some invisible threshold, when there were too many observers. Noah sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his keyboard. A thought was forming in his mind, a thought he didn't want to fully articulate even to himself. But it was there, persistent and growing. What if this wasn't a malfunction? What if it was maintenance? He spent the rest of the week digging deeper. He found references to the anomalies in obscure technical forums, buried in threads about timekeeping standards and network synchronization protocols. Most people dismissed them as statistical noise or measurement error. But a few voices stood out. Engineers who seemed to be speaking carefully, choosing their words with unusual precision. One post from a systems architect who worked on infrastructure for transcontinental data cables caught his attention. The post was 3 years old, discussing an unexplained synchronization event that had briefly disrupted financial trading systems across Asia and Europe. The username was Pacific Conduit, and they had a long posting history of thoughtful, measured technical analysis. The architect wrote, "We ran every diagnostic available, triple-checked our methodology, brought in external auditors. The timing error was real, measurable and consistent across all nodes spanning 14,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable. But there was no source, no propagation delay, no evidence of any technical cause. It simply appeared everywhere simultaneously and then corrected itself within milliseconds. The official report attributed it to a calibration error in atomic clock networks, but I've worked with atomic clocks for 20 years. I've seen them fail in every possible way. They don't fail like this. They don't fail in perfect synchronization across geographically distributed systems with independent power sources and no common failure point. Someone on our team started calling it the patch. Not an outage, not a hack, a correction. Like when you update software and it fixes bugs you didn't know existed. Management told us to drop it and move on. We dropped it, but I didn't forget. Noah read the post 5 times. Then he started searching for the term, the patch. The results were scattered but consistent. Network engineers discussing unexplained corrections that happened too fast to be manual interventions. Database administrators noting silent data repairs with no recorded cause, no script execution logs, no administrator access records, no evidence of any process that could have made the changes. Security researchers puzzled by checksum validations that fix themselves, showing corrupted data one moment and perfect integrity the next with no intermediate state. One thread from a Linux kernel development forum caught his attention. A developer had noticed that certain system logs showed timestamp corrections that preceded the events they were supposedly correcting, as if the fix had been applied before the error occurred, or more accurately, as if the error and the fix had occurred simultaneously, but the logging system could only record them sequentially. It's like watching someone edit a document in real time, the developer wrote, except the cursor is moving backwards through text that's already been written. The changes appear, and then the history adjusts to accommodate them. I've seen this 3 times now, always during periods of high system load, always resolves itself, always leaves me feeling like I glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. Another thread, this one from a forum for satellite engineers, discussed anomalies in telemetry data during orbital maneuvers. The physics doesn't work backwards, someone had written. You can't have a course correction that precedes the detection of the deviation it's correcting. But that's what the logs show. Correction applied, then deviation detected, then position normalized. The timestamps are sequential. The causality is reversed. We reported it. Got a memo back saying our logging system had a known issue with timestamp sequencing during high priority operations. Thing is, I helped design that logging system. It doesn't have that issue. Always the same pattern. Something breaks in a way that shouldn't be possible. Then something fixes it in a way that shouldn't be possible, and everyone agrees to pretend it was normal. Noah tried to reach out to the systems architect who had written the original post about the patch, but the account had been deleted, not just inactive, completely removed from the forum's database. He found 2 other engineers who had mentioned similar events in detail, and sent them carefully worded messages asking for more information. Messages that didn't sound alarmist or conspiratorial, just professional curiosity about unusual edge cases in distributed systems. One never replied. The other sent back a single sentence. I don't work in that field anymore. Noah tried following up, asking what field they worked in now. The account was deactivated the next day. On Friday afternoon, Noah took a risk. He attended an infrastructure security conference being held at a hotel near the waterfront. He wasn't registered, but he bought a day pass at the door and spent hours moving between presentation rooms and networking sessions, listening to engineers discuss threat models and backup protocols and disaster recovery plans. During a coffee break, he approached an older man who had been introduced as having worked on satellite systems for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 30 years. Noah mentioned the timing anomalies casually, framing them as a curiosity he had noticed in some archived data. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A recognition. A wariness. You noticed the corrections, the man said quietly. It wasn't a question. The what? That's what we called them, back when I was still active. The corrections. The man glanced around the room, then leaned slightly closer. You're not the first person to spot the pattern. You won't be the last. But you should know that asking questions about it openly is a good way to make your career complicated. Why? Noah asked. Because there's no good answer, no explanation that makes sense. So the people who control these systems decided the best approach was to not have the conversation at all. The man paused. I spent 2 years trying to understand what caused them. I built models, ran simulations, consulted with physicists. Nothing fit. Eventually I realised I had a choice. I could keep digging and become the crazy guy who sees patterns that aren't there. Or I could accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations and move on with my life. Which did you choose? Noah asked. The man smiled faintly. I'm retired now. I spend my time sailing and fixing old motorcycles. I sleep well at night. He set down his coffee cup. You seem like a smart person, so I'll give you the same advice someone gave me. Whatever you think you found, it's not worth the cost of pursuing it. Let it go. The man walked away before Noah could respond. That night Noah sat in his apartment with all his research spread across his desk and laptop screen. He had documentation of the anomalies. He had historical precedents. He had testimony from engineers who had seen the same things he was seeing. But he didn't have an explanation. And the more he looked at the data, the more one particular thought kept surfacing in his mind, unwanted and persistent. The anomalies looked exactly like what you would expect if reality were running on some kind of computational substrate. If the universe were information being processed rather than matter obeying physical laws. If existence itself was something that could be debugged, patched and optimized. It was an absurd thought. Noah knew that. He had never been interested in philosophy or metaphysics. He dealt with practical systems, concrete problems, measurable results. But the data didn't care what he believed. The data showed a pattern of synchronized corrections that had no technical explanation. The data showed reality behaving like a system under maintenance. Noah opened his laptop and started searching for scientific papers. Not conspiracy theories or fringe speculation. Real academic research. He found more than he expected. Digital physics. The hypothesis that the universe operates on discrete quantized units of information rather than continuous matter and energy. Papers from respected physicists at major universities, published in peer-reviewed journals. Information theory applied to cosmology. Research, suggesting that physical laws might be emergent properties of information processing. Studies on the limits of observable resolution in space-time. Simulation theory, not as science fiction, but as a serious philosophical argument developed by philosophers and computer scientists. The mathematical reasoning that suggested if it's possible to create simulated realities, and if simulated beings can create their own simulations, then the vast majority of conscious experiences must be occurring inside simulations rather than in base reality. Noah read until his eyes burned and his coffee went cold. He wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for a framework. A way to make sense of what he was seeing without abandoning rationality entirely. And what he found was this. The universe behaves suspiciously like a rendered environment, optimized for observation, conserving computational resources. Quantum mechanics only resolves into definite states when measured. The speed of light acts like a frame rate limit. Planck length functions like pixel resolution. The universe appears to operate on the principle of minimum complexity, taking shortcuts wherever observation isn't occurring. It was all theoretical, interpretations of mathematics, philosophical arguments about the nature of existence. But it fit the data. If this were a simulation, the anomalies would make perfect sense. They would be exactly what maintenance would look like. Brief moments when the system became too complex, too unstable, requiring correction, patches applied to preserve stability, updates installed without warning. Noah closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his apartment. The city lights of Seattle glowed through his window, thousands of lives proceeding normally, unaware of the pattern he'd uncovered. Or maybe aware and choosing not to care. He thought about the retired engineer's advice. Let it go. Move on. Accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations. It would be easy. He could delete his research, stop asking questions, focus on his work and his life and the things he could actually control. But he knew he wouldn't. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you notice the glitch, Every moment of normalcy becomes suspicious. Every ordinary day becomes evidence of successful maintenance. The next week, Noah took a different approach. Instead of searching for answers, he searched for other people who were asking the same questions. He found them in unexpected places, not conspiracy forums or paranoid message boards, but in private technical mailing lists and closed professional groups. Engineers, physicists, infrastructure architects who had noticed anomalies and quietly documented them. They didn't debate whether reality glitched. They debated how much was altered each time it happened. Noah spent hours reading through archived conversations. The tone was never hysterical or dramatic. These were technical professionals discussing data, but beneath the measured language there was an undercurrent of deep unease. The mailing list was called Infrastructure Anomaly Research Group, abbreviated as IARG in the message headers. It appeared to have been active for at least 7 years, with sporadic bursts of activity that Noah quickly realised corresponded exactly with the correction events he had documented. One thread caught his attention. It was from 4 years ago, started by a network security researcher who had noticed unexplained changes in historical server logs. Not errors, changes. Data that had been recorded one way and then, after a correction event, was recorded differently. As if the past had been quietly edited. The initial post read, "I maintain rotating backups across 3 geographically distributed data centers with independent backup schedules. Standard practice for redundancy. During a routine verification check following the September 22nd event, I discovered discrepancies between backup sets that should be identical. Not corruption, the data integrity checks pass perfectly. The data is simply different. Transaction logs showing different timestamps for the same events. User activity records with different sequences. Nothing critical enough to cause operational problems, but different nonetheless. I've cross-referenced against hard copy printouts from 2 weeks ago. The printouts don't match current digital records. Either my paper archives are wrong, or the data has been retroactively modified. Given that paper can't spontaneously change, I'm forced to consider the latter." The responses in the thread were measured but alarming. A database administrator from a major healthcare provider confirmed similar observations. Patient admission records showing different room assignments than what our nurses documented in physical logbooks. Times of medication administration off by minutes. Nothing clinically significant. No harm to patients. But the electronic records don't match the written documentation. We assumed data entry errors, but the volume is unusual, and it all appeared after the timing anomaly. A systems architect from a financial institution added, "We found transaction sequencing anomalies in our trade execution logs. Trades that our traders swear occurred in a different order than what the system shows. We have phone recordings of trade confirmations that reference transaction IDs that don't appear in our database in the sequence discussed. The transactions exist. The IDs are correct, but the temporal ordering is wrong. Compliance is treating it as a logging bug, but our logging system has been battle-tested for 15 years. Another message, from someone identifying themselves only as a university research administrator, was more direct. Our particle physics lab runs experiments with nanosecond precision. We maintain detailed lab notebooks, actual physical notebooks, alongside digital records. After each correction event, we've noticed small discrepancies. Nothing that invalidates our research, but enough to be troubling. Detector readings that don't match handwritten notes. Calibration values that differ from photographed whiteboard calculations. We started keeping sealed photographic archives as a control. The photographs don't change, the digital records do. We haven't published these findings because we have no framework to explain them. The thread continued for pages. Scientists discovering that old experimental data had slightly different values than they remembered recording. System architects finding configuration files that didn't match their implementation notes. Archivists noticing that database timestamps had been subtly adjusted across entire collections. All of it dismissed as human error. Memory mistakes, documentation failures, cognitive bias. But the timing always matched the correction events, and then about 40 messages into the thread, someone with the username architect773 posted something that seemed to stop the conversation cold. If this were a simulation, this is exactly how maintenance would look. Not catastrophic failures, not obvious glitches, just subtle corrections to preserve consistency. Think about how version control works in software development. When you update code, you don't just change the current version, you can rewrite the entire Git history if you need to. You can make it so a bug never existed in the first place. The system doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be coherent enough that observers don't notice the seams. And when consistency breaks down because too many events are occurring, too many observers are measuring things, too much complexity is emerging from the underlying rule set, the system performs maintenance. It patches itself. It retroactively edits causality to preserve coherence. Reality updated without warning. Version controlled like any other codebase. We're not experiencing glitches. We're experiencing optimization. The universe is being debugged around us, and we're part of the code being revised. The thread had no replies after that message. It was locked by a moderator with a note. Moving this discussion offline. Contact list admin if interested in continued technical consultation. Noah scrolled further through the archives. He found other threads with similar patterns. Technical discussions that started normally and then gradually escalated into uncomfortable territory. Questions about the nature of causality. Speculation about whether physical laws were descriptive or prescriptive. Debates about whether consciousness was a feature or a bug. And in every case, once the conversation reached a certain threshold of explicit speculation about the fundamental nature of reality, it was shut down or moved offline. He found one more exchange that chilled him. It was brief, just 2 messages. The first was from someone asking, "Has anyone else noticed that the corrections seem to be getting more frequent? 13 years ago, my records show one event every 18 to 24 months. Now we're seeing them every 4 to 6 months. What does it mean if the maintenance intervals are shortening?" The reply came from a username Noah didn't recognize. It means the system is becoming less stable. Complexity is increasing exponentially. Moore's law applied to reality itself. More observers, more measurements, more quantum states being resolved into definite values. The simulation, or whatever this is, has to work harder to maintain coherence. Think about running a game engine. The more objects you render, the more physics you simulate, the more processing power you need. Eventually you hit computational limits. You have to optimize, reduce polygon counts, simplify physics calculations, update the render distance. We might be experiencing the cosmic equivalent of a game engine struggling to maintain 60 frames per second. That thread had also been locked, but unlike the others, it had a different moderator note. This group is being reorganized. All members will receive individual contact from administration regarding continued participation. Noah tried to contact the list administrator. The email bounced back with a permanent failure message. The mailing list itself seemed to have been archived and made entirely private, inaccessible without credentials he didn't have. He searched for Architect 773 across different platforms. No results. The username appeared only in that single thread, in that single post, never again. But the ideas in that post wouldn't leave his mind. Version control applied to reality, the universe being debugged, maintenance intervals shortening as complexity increased. It explained everything. The timing anomalies, the retroactive edits, the fact that nothing catastrophic ever happened, because catastrophic failures were exactly what the patches were designed to prevent. It was the kind of explanation that seemed insane until you looked at the evidence, and then it seemed like the only explanation that fit. Noah understood why. What would happen if this information went mainstream? If everyone knew that reality occasionally glitched and corrected itself? That the past might be quietly edited? That existence itself appeared to be running on some kind of computational substrate? Chaos, panic, existential crisis on a global scale, or maybe nothing. Maybe people would shrug and go back to their lives because knowing the truth changed nothing about how they had to live. That was the real horror, Noah realized. Not the possibility that reality was a simulation, but the fact that it didn't matter. If awareness changes nothing, if rebellion is irrelevant, if escape is impossible, then what difference does discovery make? The simulation doesn't need belief, it only needs compliance. Noah kept digging anyway. He couldn't help himself. He expanded his search to look for physical evidence. If reality was being corrected, there should be residue, artifacts that survived the updates, inconsistencies that couldn't be edited away. He found more than he expected. People reported small, shared false memories. The Mandela effect, they called it. Thousands of people remembering the same details wrong. Logos that looked different than they remembered. Movie quotes that were never actually said. Geographic features in slightly different locations. Historical events with altered details. All dismissed as cognitive bias, faulty memory, social contamination of recollection. But Noah noticed the timing. Spikes in reports of the Mandela effect clustered around the correction events, as if the patches were imperfect, as if when reality was updated some observers retained memories of the previous version. He found references to sudden changes in digital archives, Wikipedia articles that people swore had contained different information, news reports that contradicted personal documentation, photographs that showed details no one remembered being there before. Again, all explained away. Edit histories mistaken. Personal records inaccurate, camera angles misremembered. But the pattern was there, persistent, undeniable if you were willing to look. Noah created a timeline, mapping correction events against spikes in reported anomalies. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to be significant. Strong enough to suggest that reality wasn't as stable as people assumed. He was still working on the timeline late one night when he found something that made his hands freeze over his keyboard. In one of the corrected datasets from the October event, buried deep in a metadata field that should have contained only system information, Noah found something impossible. A comment. A plain language annotation that read, "Stability preserved. Continue." Not code, not an error message, not diagnostic information. A note. Written as if by someone monitoring the process. Noah checked the metadata structure. He pulled up the database schema documentation, traced through the field definitions, verified the data types. There was no reason for a comment to be there. The field was defined as a binary timestamp with millisecond precision. It should contain exactly 8 bytes of temporal data, nothing more. No field in the database schema would accept plain text in that location. It shouldn't exist, but it did. He examined the raw hexadecimal data. The timestamp was there, perfectly valid, but appended to it, in clear ASCII text where nothing should be, were those 3 words. Noah's hands were shaking slightly as he began searching for similar annotations in other corrected datasets. He expanded his query parameters, searching not just the October event, but all the historical corrections he had documented. The search took 40 minutes to complete. He found 12 more annotations, each one embedded in impossible locations, each one written in plain language, each one suggesting oversight, monitoring management from somewhere outside the system itself. From the May event of the previous year, coherence restored, observer population stable, complexity within acceptable parameters. From the March event 2 years prior, update complete, no critical awareness detected, standard monitoring resumed. From the September event 4 years back, extensive revision required, multiple timeline branches collapsed, consensus reality maintained. That last one made Noah stop breathing for a moment. Multiple timeline branches collapsed, as if reality wasn't a single linear progression, but a tree of possibilities being constantly pruned. He kept reading. From the November event 6 years ago, memory revision partially successful, minor residual awareness acceptable, does not threaten coherence. From the February event 7 years back, causality loop resolved, retroactive continuity established, No observer impact detected. From one of the earlier events he had found, computational overhead reduced, observer resolution decreased in non-critical sectors, performance optimized. The annotations weren't consistent in style. Some were terse, almost like log entries. Others were more detailed, almost conversational. But they all shared certain characteristics. They all referenced observers. They all discussed coherence and stability. They all treated reality as something that could be managed, optimized, revised. Noah found one annotation that was different from the others, longer, more detailed. It appeared in a data set from an event 3 years ago that he had almost missed because it was so minor. Just a brief flicker of timing errors across a handful of systems. The annotation read, "Localized patch applied to Sector 7 Gamma 93. Quantum state resolution exceeding computational budget in high-density observer region. Implemented selective detail reduction. Decreased weather pattern complexity by 12%. Reduced background character behavioral diversity by 8%. Suspended non-observed astronomical event processing until observer attention redirected. Efficiency gained 37%. Note: observer identified as research installation continues investigation of correction events. Recommend enhanced monitoring but no direct intervention. Historical pattern suggests self-limiting awareness. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. Intervention would create unnecessary complexity and potential awareness cascade. Current strategy of plausible alternative explanation remains effective." Noah read that annotation 10 times. Each time, his sense of unreality deepened. Sector 7 Gamma 93, weather pattern complexity reduced, background character behavioral diversity, non-observed astronomical events suspended. The language was precise, technical, and utterly alien in its implications. It described reality as something being actively managed, optimized, edited in real time based on where observers were paying attention, and that final note about an observer, a research installation, continuing to investigate. Could that be referencing someone like him, or one of the scientists from the mailing list? Someone had noticed the patterns, and whoever wrote this annotation had decided not to intervene, because historical data suggested the awareness would be self-limiting. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. That phrase lodged itself in Noah's mind like a splinter. It suggested that this had happened before, that people had discovered the truth and then, what? Given up? Moved on? Accepted that knowing changed nothing? He found 2 more annotations that seemed to reference observer awareness directly. Note: increased correlation analysis activity detected among infrastructure monitoring personnel following last correction event. Pattern consistent with previous awareness spikes. Recommend no action. Self-terminating behaviour expected within standard time frame. And another: observer cluster in northwestern technology sector showing elevated pattern recognition activity. Probability of explicit simulation hypothesis formulation 63%. Risk assessment minimal. No historical precedent for awareness propagation beyond initial cluster. Containment through social mechanisms adequate. Containment through social mechanisms. Noah thought about the engineers who had stopped responding to his messages, the mailing list that had been shut down, the careers that had been redirected, not through force or intimidation, but through the simple social reality that you couldn't talk about this stuff without sounding crazy. The system didn't need to suppress the truth. It just needed to make the truth socially unacceptable to discuss seriously. He found one final annotation that seemed different from all the others. It wasn't attached to a correction event. It was embedded in a routine system backup from 6 months ago, in a data set that showed no anomalies at all, just normal, everyday data processing. But there, in a field that should have been empty, was a single line. The observers cannot see what they are not looking for. The system cannot fail in ways they can imagine. Truth is a function of perspective, and perspective is a privilege we grant selectively. They will continue. We will continue. Coherence will be maintained. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. These weren't just system logs. These were messages. Not for him, not for anyone in the simulation, but they existed within it, preserved in the data like fossils in sedimentary rock, proof that reality was being watched, managed, maintained by something that existed outside the framework of the existence he knew, and that something new people were noticing, knew and didn't care. Because knowing, in the end, changed nothing. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart beating faster than it should. He felt like he was looking at something he wasn't supposed to see, a note left behind by whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He thought about going public, releasing the data, showing people what he had found. But then he thought it through. What would happen? The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as corruption or injection from external tools. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove, and even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realised. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work, stop paying bills, stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. Not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing. Weeks passed. October became November. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. And then, on a Thursday morning in mid-November, Noah noticed another micro-correction beginning. He was at his desk monitoring the same systems he had been watching for weeks when the first timestamp drift appeared. It started in Hong Kong. Financial systems operated by the Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited. The error appeared at exactly 9:47 and 16 seconds local time. Noah's monitoring software flagged it immediately. He pulled up the detailed logs. The drift was identical to the pattern he had seen before. Microsecond-level desynchronization appearing across multiple independent systems simultaneously. Then weather satellites over the Pacific. The Himawari satellite network operated by the Japan Meteorological Agency showed the same timestamp anomaly, followed by telecommunications networks across Southeast Asia, then India, then the Middle East. The pattern was unmistakable. Another update was starting. Noah opened every monitoring tool he had. He had spent the past 3 weeks building a custom dashboard specifically for this moment. Real-time feeds from 43 different infrastructure networks across 6 continents. Automated alerts configured to detect the exact signature of a correction event. The alerts were firing in sequence, like a wave propagating around the planet. Europe. The European Organisation for the Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites showing anomalies. Banking systems operated by the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication experiencing timing errors. Power grid management systems across the Nordic countries flagging synchronization warnings. North America, air traffic control systems, the Global Positioning Systems satellite network, hospital databases, university research networks, stock exchanges, all of them showing the same pattern within seconds of each other. Noah watched it happen live. He had imagined this moment would be dramatic, frightening, somehow apocalyptic, but it wasn't. It was quiet, clinical, just data flowing across his screens in patterns that shouldn't exist. He checked the error codes, all identical. Air sync, Anomaly autocorrect. The same ghost code that appeared in every correction event, never defined in any official documentation. Everything continued normally. Through his office window, he could see the Seattle skyline proceeding with its usual Thursday morning rhythm. Delivery trucks making their rounds, construction workers on a building site 3 blocks away operating a crane, a flock of seagulls wheeling above the waterfront, their flight patterns governed by instinct and aerodynamics, and the simple physics of survival. People laughed in the hallway outside his office. Someone was talking about their plans for the weekend. A coffee machine beeped in the break room, the mundane sounds of ordinary existence unfolding exactly as it always did. Stock markets opened and processed millions of transactions. The opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange rang at exactly 9:30 Eastern Time, triggering the beginning of another day of trading. Algorithms executed buy and sell orders based on mathematical models of value and risk, none of them aware that the infrastructure processing their transactions was experiencing a global timing anomaly. Airplanes took off and landed safely. Noah pulled up flight tracking data on one of his monitors. He could see thousands of aircraft in motion around the planet. Commercial flights, cargo planes, private jets, all of them navigating 3-dimensional space with precision measured in meters and seconds. The correction event was passing through the systems that guided them. Not a single plane deviated from its flight path. Hospital equipment monitored patient vitals without error. He had access to status dashboards from 3 major healthcare systems through his contract work. Heart rate monitors, ventilators, diagnostic imaging systems, all of them continuing to function perfectly despite the timestamp anomalies flowing through their network infrastructure. Birds flew outside his window, following paths determined by instinct and physics. Noah watched them for a moment, these small lives completely unaware that the fabric of reality around them was being quietly adjusted. They banked and turned in formation, responding to environmental cues that were themselves being processed and rendered by whatever system maintained this existence. Reality did not break. It adjusted. Noah watched the correction propagate across his screens like a wave of silent maintenance, passing through the infrastructure of existence itself. He had configured his monitoring software to track not just the anomalies but the corrections, the moment when the timestamp errors were resolved, the instant when coherence was restored. The corrections followed the same geographic pattern as the anomalies, but in reverse, starting in North America and flowing back toward Asia, as if the system were validating the patches, confirming stability before moving on. He pulled up his annotation scanner, the tool he had built to search for those impossible plain text comments embedded in the corrected data. He had configured it to run automatically during any detected correction event, scraping through the updated datasets in real time looking for new messages. The scanner found something within minutes, a new annotation, longer than any he had seen before. Correction Event 773 complete. Temporal coherence restored across all monitored sectors. Observer population, 9.2 billion, increase of 1.7% since last correction. Quantum state resolutions per second, 3.8 trillion, exceeding design parameters by 19%. Computational overhead increased by 22%. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. Recommendation: increase correction frequency or implement selective detail reduction protocols. Note: high complexity observer identified in northwestern sector continues pattern analysis of correction events. Awareness level elevated but remains within acceptable parameters. Individual demonstrates technical competence and pattern recognition, capabilities above baseline. Probability of actionable conclusion, minimal. Probability of awareness propagation, negligible. No intervention required. Observer will reach logical endpoint, acknowledgement of powerlessness, within standard time frame. Historical data suggests integration without disruption. Continue monitoring. Noah read the annotation 3 times, each word precisely chosen, each phrase carrying implications that expanded like fractals the more he thought about them. 9.2 billion observers, The global population counted and catalogued 3.8 trillion quantum state resolutions per second. Reality being calculated, rendered, maintained at a scale beyond human comprehension. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. The system was struggling. The maintenance intervals were shortening because the universe, or the simulation, or whatever this was becoming harder to sustain. And that note. High complexity observer in northwestern sector. That was him. Had to be him. Northwestern sector. Seattle was in the Pacific Northwest. An observer analysing correction events. They were talking about him specifically. Probability of actionable conclusion. Minimal. That phrase cut deeper than anything else. They knew he would figure it out. They expected people to figure it out. But they also knew it wouldn't matter. Because what was he going to do? What could anyone do? Observer will reach logical endpoint. Acknowledgement of powerlessness. Within standard time frame. He thought about the retired engineer who had warned him to let it go. The deleted accounts, the closed mailing lists, the careers redirected into safer territory. They had all reached the same logical endpoint. The moment when curiosity transformed into acceptance. When understanding became indistinguishable from surrender. Noah checked his other monitors. The correction was completing. The timestamp errors were resolving. The systems were stabilizing. In another few minutes, it would be over. Reality would have been successfully maintained for another cycle. He thought about going public. He had all the evidence, the annotations, the historical patterns, the correlation data. He could compile it into a report, post it online, send it to journalists and scientists and anyone who might listen. But he had already played out that scenario in his mind 100 times. He knew what would happen. The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as data corruption or injection from external tools or elaborate hoaxes. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove completely. And even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted by a few researchers or conspiracy theorists or curious engineers, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. People would still go to work, pay bills, fall in love, raise children, pursue careers, build lives. The day-to-day mechanics of existence would continue because there was no alternative. You couldn't opt out of reality just because you knew it was being actively maintained. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realised. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work? Stop paying bills? Stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. The correction completed. Noah watched the final system stabilize. The timestamp errors resolved. The anomalies corrected. The ghost error codes disappeared from the logs. Everything proceeded normally, as if nothing had happened. As if the fabric of reality hadn't just been debugged and optimized around 9 billion observers who remained completely unaware. Noah's phone buzzed. A text message from his manager. Team meeting at 2, conference room B. Don't forget the quarterly review slides. The ordinary demands of ordinary existence. Meetings, deadlines, performance reviews. The machinery of professional life continuing its endless rotation. He looked at his monitors one last time. The data was there. The evidence was preserved. The annotations existed in databases scattered across multiple secured systems. Future researchers, if they looked carefully enough, would find the same patterns he had found. They would ask the same questions, reach the same conclusions, and they would face the same choice. Acceptance or obsession, integration or isolation. Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. The thought didn't frighten him anymore. It was just information. Just another pattern in the endless complexity of existence. When the correction finished, Noah checked the annotated data sets. There was a new comment, embedded in the same impossible location. Patch applied successfully. Observer population stable. Complexity within acceptable parameters. Continue standard operations. Noah saved the data to his encrypted drive. He would add it to his timeline. He would document the event. He would note the correlations and patterns, not because it would lead anywhere, not because it would change anything, but because it was true. And truth, even meaningless truth, deserved to be recorded. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. He built better tools, more sophisticated scanning algorithms, deeper analysis frameworks, not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing, even if the watchers were themselves being watched. Weeks passed. November became December. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft, wrapping everything in mist that made the buildings look like they were only partially rendered, their upper floors fading into low-resolution fog. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. He dated occasionally with limited success. He visited his parents for Thanksgiving and said nothing about what he'd discovered. He played pickup, basketball on Sunday mornings, and pretended to care about whether his team won or lost. The machinery of existence ground forward, indifferent to his knowledge of its inner workings. But he kept monitoring, and in the quiet hours of early morning, when the city slept and his apartment was silent except for the hum of his computer equipment, he would review the annotations he had collected, reading them like ancient texts, searching for meaning in the precise language of whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He found patterns in the annotations themselves. The style evolved over time. Early annotations were terse, almost mechanical. Recent ones were more elaborate, more conversational, as if the maintainers were becoming more confident or less concerned about being discovered. Or maybe, Noah thought, they wanted to be discovered. Maybe the annotations were intentional breadcrumbs, a test to see which observers would notice, a way to identify the high-complexity individuals who might pose problems or might be useful for some purpose he couldn't begin to imagine. He found one annotation from an older correction event that seemed to address this directly. Embedded reference markers continue to function as designed. Complexity-weighted observer selection proceeding as expected. High pattern recognition individuals will discover annotations and draw appropriate conclusions. This creates no operational problems and may serve useful function in future scenario branches. Awareness of maintenance is not equivalent to understanding of purpose. Observers can know they are observed without comprehending the observation framework. Continue strategic transparency protocol. Strategic transparency. They wanted some people to find out. The system was designed to allow discovery by certain types of minds while keeping the truth socially marginalized and individually powerless. It was elegant, in a horrifying way. You couldn't call it a conspiracy if the evidence was right there in the data for anyone who looked carefully enough. You couldn't claim suppression if nobody was actively stopping you from talking about it. The containment was built into human psychology itself. The social cost of sounding crazy, the professional risk of pursuing unprovable claims, the existential exhaustion of knowing something that changes nothing. On a Friday afternoon in early December, Noah received an email. No sender name, just an address composed of random characters at a domain he didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The email contained a single sentence. "You're not the only one watching. We meet Tuesdays. Seattle Public Library, 4th floor study room 7, 7 p.m. Come if you want. Don't if you don't. Either way, you've already made your choice." Noah stared at the email for a long time. He checked the headers, tried to trace the routing, ran every analysis tool he knew. The email was real, not spoofed, but the origin was obscured. Through enough layers that he would need forensic resources, he didn't have to track it back. A group, other people who had noticed, other high-complexity observers, who had found the patterns and couldn't let them go. The email made no claims, offered no promises, just information and a choice. Noah thought about the retired engineer's warning, about the deleted accounts and closed mailing lists, about the annotation that described observers reaching logical endpoints and integrating without disruption. Was this part of the containment? A honeypot to identify and monitor the people who couldn't accept powerlessness? Or was it genuine? A community of the uncomfortably aware? The email was sent on Friday. Tuesday was 4 days away. Noah spent the weekend thinking about it. He went hiking in the Cascades on Saturday, pushing himself up muddy trails until his legs burned and his lungs ached. The physical exhaustion felt clean, uncomplicated. Trees grew according to simple rules. Water flowed downhill. Gravity operated consistently. Out here, away from networks and databases and infrastructure, the simulation felt less oppressive. Or maybe that was the point. Maybe the natural world was easier to render, computationally cheaper than the complexity of human civilization. On Sunday night, he made his decision. Tuesday evening, Noah walked into the Seattle Public Library at 6:55. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, found study room 7. The door was closed, no light visible through the frosted glass window. He stood outside for 2 minutes, hand on the door handle, weighing the choice one final time. Then he opened the door. The room was empty, completely empty. No people, no furniture except the standard library table and chairs, no note, no sign that anyone had been there or was planning to be there. Noah stood in the doorway feeling like an idiot. It had been a test or a joke, or maybe the email itself was just a glitch, a piece of spam that his pattern-seeking brain had turned into meaning. He was about to leave when he noticed something on the whiteboard mounted to the wall, a single line of text in black marker. If you're reading this, you already know. Knowing is a stuff. Going further only makes it harder. This is your last exit. Take it. Below that, in different handwriting. Or don't. Room 7, next Tuesday, same time, we'll be here. Noah read both messages 3 times. The first was a warning. The second was an invitation. 2 voices, 2 philosophies. Accept and move on, or commit and connect with others who couldn't let it go. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the whiteboard. Then he erased both messages carefully, leaving no trace. He left the library and walked home through the cold December night, his breath visible in the air, streetlights creating small pools of illumination against the darkness. The city was beautiful in a way he hadn't noticed in years. The rain slicked, streets reflected coloured lights. Buildings stood like monuments to human persistence. People moved through their lives with purpose and dignity and hope, all of it potentially simulated, all of it possibly being debugged and optimized even as he observed it. And somehow, knowing that made it no less real, no less valuable, no less worthy of appreciation. The simulation, if that's what it was, contained real consciousness, real pain and real joy, real choices with real consequences. Whether the substrate was physical matter or information being processed somewhere beyond comprehension didn't change the lived experience. You were still responsible for your choices, still accountable for your actions, still capable of love and creation and meaning. The truth was both terrifying and liberating. Reality might be maintained by forces beyond your control, but your experience of it was still yours. The simulation might set the rules, but you still had to play the game. And playing well or poorly, kindly or cruelly, courageously or fearfully, those choices still mattered within the context you were given. Noah reached his apartment and climbed the stairs to his floor. He unlocked his door and went inside. His computer equipment was still running, monitors glowing in the darkness, data streaming across screens that nobody was watching. He sat down at his desk and checked his monitoring tools. The systems were stable, no anomalies, no corrections, just the normal operation of global infrastructure humming along invisibly, keeping civilization running. He opened a new document and started typing. Not a report, not an exposé, just a record. a detailed chronicle of everything he had discovered, written in precise technical language, documented with evidence and analysis and careful reasoning. He wrote for 3 hours, barely pausing. When he finished, he had a 20-page document that laid out the entire pattern, the timing anomalies, the historical precedents, the annotations, the implications. He saved it to multiple encrypted backups. Then he exported it as a PDF and attached it to an email draft. The recipient field was empty. He stared at it for a long moment, cursor blinking. He could send this to journalists, scientists, government agencies. He could release it publicly, post it on every platform available. Or he could delete it, walk away, accept the logical endpoint that had been predicted for him. Or he could do something else entirely. Save it. Keep it as insurance or evidence or simply as proof to himself that he hadn't imagined any of this. Archive it and move forward, carrying the knowledge quietly, watching and waiting for whatever came next. Noah made his choice. He deleted the email draft, kept the document, and opened his calendar next Tuesday evening. Room 7, same time. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some truths don't lead to liberation. Some knowledge only brings the burden of awareness without, the power of action. But at least you don't have to carry it alone. He closed his monitoring tools and returned to his assigned work. Error logs that needed reviewing, reports that needed writing, the ordinary invisible labour of maintaining systems that most people never thought about. Outside his window, Seattle went about its day. Commuters drove to work, students attended classes, baristas made coffee, children played in parks. The city hummed with the energy of millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex for any individual to comprehend. Reality, simulated or not, continued. And that, Noah understood, was the final truth. Simulations don't end when they're discovered. They end when they're no longer useful. Until then, they run. They update. They patch themselves when complexity threatens coherence. And the observers within them go on observing, living, dying, loving, struggling, never quite sure whether the ground beneath their feet is as solid as it seems, but walking forward anyway because there is nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but continue. Noah turned back to his work. Somewhere in the logs he was reviewing there would be more anomalies, more patterns, more evidence of the invisible maintenance that kept existence coherent. He would find them. He would document them. He would watch the next update and the one after that. Not because it mattered in any cosmic sense, but because once you see the pattern, you can't look away, even when you know that looking changes nothing. The screen in front of him refreshed, loading new data. In the bottom corner, a system notification appeared briefly and then vanished. System status, normal, all processes operating within expected parameters. Noah smiled faintly and kept working. Outside his window, Seattle continued. Rain fell. Lights glowed. People lived and died and loved and struggled and created meaning in a universe that might or might not be as solid as it seemed. And somewhere beyond the observable framework of reality, the maintainers made a note in their logs. Observer 773 showing expected integration pattern. Awareness stable. Behavior predictable. Continue standard monitoring. No intervention required. The patch had been applied. The system had adapted. Everything was proceeding as calculated. The simulation continued. The observers continued. The patches continued. And reality, carefully maintained and quietly corrected, proceeded exactly as designed. Somewhere beyond Noah's comprehension, beyond the scope of his monitoring tools and data sets, the system logged another successful update. Patch applied. Stability preserved. Continue.